started. So thanks for coming, everybody. A number of board members here and SVPA architects and Carl Nelson Construction. So this is a site committee meeting, so a little less formal than a regular board meeting. So there's not, we have just, the agenda is to start the master planning conversation with some of the data and things from our Nelson and SVPA. So again, there's no, in committee meetings, there's no action items, no decisions are made, anything like that. It's just conversation. So with that, I'm going to sit down and turn it over to these guys.
Hello?
Is it on the drum? Had to just flip it on.
Yep, I got it.
There you go.
There we go. All right, so this is the meeting to go over the master planning. This is the first time that anyone has seen this information. It's not set in stone. It's throwing out some ideas in order to get some feedback. So with that said, if you have questions, make sure you ask it. And remember, just like John said, this is going to be a conversation, and we welcome all feedback on this. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. At our last meeting, we went through the facility assessment where we looked at all the different schools. And the first few slides here are just going to be a recap of that. Then I'll hand it over to the architects to talk about the master planning, and then the engineer at the end to talk about potential uses for the Esser funded projects, which is the COVID money that you guys have for the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. So just a quick summary of the buildings that you have. The middle school was built in 1909, had a pretty major renovation in 2006, HVAC upgrades in 2019. High school was built in 1997 with a new chiller this year. And as far as the elementary schools, they were all built about the same time, in the 1950s and early 60s. And as you can see, there was a major addition in Lincoln in 1997, in Harlan 1997, Van Allen in 1988, and 1992 at Salem, which was just a little media center added outside of the building footprint. And then a little summary of the energy cost per square foot for each building. It goes down from $1.01 per square foot all the way up to $1.89 per square foot at Salem. And why is Salem's cost so high? One, the cost of the energy is spread out over a smaller square foot of the building, but also Salem is all electric heat. They don't have any gas there. So Salem's energy cost is 39% higher than Lincoln and 87% higher than Van Allen. So this is just a quick summary slide showing you the square footages. Salem is 12,000 square feet, so it's a very small building. Van Allen, of the 4 elementary schools, is almost 3.5 times bigger than Salem. So when it comes to operational costs, this is the cost to run the building, the utilities, and all other costs except for personnel. And we have the annual cost per student and the annual cost per square foot. And these numbers are important if you're thinking about what will we save if we don't use this building anymore. That's the purpose of these numbers. So you can look, and both the high school and Salem appear to be very high when it comes per student, but the high school has a lot of extra space, gyms and media centers. And so when you go to look at it per square foot, the high school is pretty much in the average category, but Salem is still pretty high. Again, the energy cost is high. It's a small school, a small number of students per teacher. All of that just kind of adds up and makes it a more expensive facility to run. So when it comes to overcrowding, the yellow represents the current square feet per student. You might want to cross that out. I have it incorrectly on the label there. It's not students per square foot, it's square foot per student. And the red is the current design standards for facilities. So if you're building a new facility, that's how many square feet you would allow for your expected student enrollment. And the suggested square feet is always a range. So for the smaller buildings, we see we got 45 square feet for Salem because that is in that smaller category of 15,000 square feet or under. So that's the difference there. But you can see Lincoln is very, very overcrowded. It's 90 square feet per student. And if you've been in there, it's probably not a surprise. You've got teachers in little shafts behind the stairs, only this wide, and I can call it their office. So the numbers show what's going on there. So when we look at the site, again, the yellow is your actual acreage per school, and the maroon is the design suggestion. So you can see, these were designed as neighborhood schools. They functioned beautifully as a neighborhood school. When kids walked to school, they walked home. But the world has changed. It's not really how they function anymore. And so the current site design allows for more parking, more drop-off, more pickup, and that's what you're experiencing with these neighborhood schools. One thing that is very interesting is how much extra site you have at the high school. So I'm just wondering, is there opportunity on the high school site? So just to kind of wrap it up, because it's a lot of statistics, but I looked at the 4 elementary schools, and if they ranked best in the previous graphs that I showed you, I ranked it number 1 as best. If it was out of the 4, the worst, then I gave it a number 4. So major renovation is the last date of the major renovation. So the newer the renovation, the better it ranked. So 1 would be have the newest renovation, 4 would have the oldest renovation. And then we got energy, square foot costs, overcrowding, operational costs per student, annual operational and utility costs, and site costs. So the summary here is it appears that Van Allen and Harlan are functioning better, at least on these categories, than Lincoln and Salem. So the next is just 2 quick graph trends. This shows the in-district students. The red line is the in-district students, and then the yellow line is the certified enrollment. And so you can see that students want to come to Mount Pleasant. You have more students coming here that lives here. And that's a very good sign for your district. But when we look at the numbers about enrollment out and enrollment in, you can see the enrollment in has been pretty steady, even though the population is decreasing. But you see the enrollment out is increasing a little bit, especially the last 4 years. And so I think might be able to address that if we add more functions to the high school, such as improved CTE or the auditorium. It might turn those numbers around, and Vias is going to talk a little bit more about that. And this last line is the preschoolers. So that's just kind of a summary of the last meeting, talking a little bit about what you have, and then Vias is going to talk about some of the options, and I'll let her take it from here.
Sounds good.
It's in the document.
All right. So first of all, I want to thank CD and Dan. They've done a great job of helping put this presentation together. A lot of the statistics we showed you at the last meeting of each building was very, I think, well summarized and graphically summarized in that first segment. So if there are any questions before we jump into the master planning piece, we'd be happy to address any questions about the overview of sort of the statistics that came out of the assessment phase. Okay, so the next step that we want to go through, we have been looking at what we saw in each of the buildings. We've gone through, we've had a couple of meetings with the site the site group, we've discussed what we feel may be some priorities that are upcoming for the district and issues that need to be discussed openly and honestly about what's the best solution for the long term, not just the next few years, but 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. In your handouts, at the very last page, there's an outline of what we're going to go through over the next probably 30 minutes or so. As we were looking at the process, we identified a couple of things that came to mind right away. It seems that your oldest and least functional buildings are some of the buildings that are serving central, some of your support services. The bus maintenance facility is a major concern. The age of that building and the functionality of it's a concern. The district is leasing space for central office. Some of the central receiving and printing is in a facility that's lived its useful life. So first set of items that we thought we'd talk about is what are some options to address concerns with your most significant building issues as it relates to support services. So we'll talk about a couple different options for looking at maybe building a new bus and transportation facility or bus maintenance storage building. And are there some scenarios that might work well for support services, the central office, your central receiving, the print shop, all of those kinds of functions. We'll talk through a couple of scenarios that may be worth considering in that piece. Then the next thing we'll talk about is your elementary schools and your middle school. We have a couple of scenarios that we'd like to open up for discussion. I think this is going to be probably the topic that the community is going to be most passionate about. What's the long-term best solution for our elementary schools and or our middle school? We have two options to discuss. That doesn't mean those are the only options. I mean, certainly there is, I would call it a third option to try to maintain the status quo and continue to use those buildings, renovate them, maintain them, maybe open just one new building to address overcrowding. But we're looking at maybe some older options that might be a better long-term educational facility for the elementary and middle school. So we'll go over two options there. And then the third category we're going to cover is the high school. There are some improvements that would be appropriate here at the high school and things that we've talked about. The ag program is one that was at the top of the list from the very first conversation that we had with the group. And so we'll talk about the high school as the third project. So I'm going to turn it over to Damien to start with the support services, then I'll go over the elementary and middle school, and then Damien will wrap up with the high school.
All right, stand up.
I'm Damian Spillman with SDPA Architects. So again, as Vitus was talking about, we talked about the support services. We kind of already alluded to those the buildings that those support services are in. We kind of discussed it at our last facilities assessment meeting. So this is kind of to bring it back to what are some options there for those different spaces. So the first option here is a new building to house all district support services. Again, that would be looking at, we have the support services here, the central office, central receiving, print shop, storage, busing, and facilities. So that's roughly a 45 to 50,000 square foot building. Whether that's a new building or an existing building that we buy and renovate. So it's just giving a scale of, through our facilities assessment, we did some programming, like space needs programming, with our discussions with the different user groups in these different spaces. And that's kind of where the square footages are coming from that we'll look at on the next slides as well. So it gives you an idea of not just making up a number from a square footage standpoint, look at all the needs that go into those buildings.
So one other quick comment on this, that 45 to 50,000 square feet for the busing and transportation, I think there was, I want to say 18 buses that would.
18, yeah.
So about 18,000 square foot of that would not necessarily need to be an enclosed building, but some sort of protected or covered space so that they can get under cover. They're not covered in snow. So roughly 18,000 would be a much cheaper expense construction than the remainder, which would be a normal, fully enclosed and heated, cooled, and so forth. So.
Right. Yeah, that's when you look at that slide where it says 24,700. A good chunk of that is just that covered bus parking Yeah, you would go to the next graphic. Yeah, that's fine. So again, this is kind of, there's a couple options here for the busing and transportation building. You can see it's around 24,000 square feet there. So we kind of looked at some different scenarios, especially with that busing, because it needs such a large site for just the parking of the buses and vehicles, plus the maintenance building. So obviously the existing location is the buildings on a day, there's not enough spots to park buses. So that could either be again, a newer building, or you find a building that's existing that can be transformed into a busing facility. And then the facilities department, sharing space with central receiving, Wisdom Quest. Right now, that's kind of a, the reason why it's right there, because it kind of go both of these, and as we'll look at our option to repurpose Van Allen, given that that's the largest square footage building, and also the site is very desirable, just how much space they have to the north, and they already have off-street parking, things like that. So we did create a graphic for that, but that, again, Van Allen's about 40,000 square foot. So what we've done, we programmed those different spaces that need kind of new homes, and then looked at the existing Van Allen school, just purely from a square footage standpoint, not getting into, well, there's a column here, how does it all function? Just a high level, just want to see how some of those components can fit on that site and in that building. You'll have it in your printout as well. So again, this is looking at basically all the support functions minus the busing and transportation. So, looking at central office, central receiving, Wisdom Quest, homeschool, and then maintenance. So, but let's start at the central office, and again, these square footages are kind of programmed from our conversations with the school district. Graphically, they're close to what those square footages are. They may be a little bit, most of them are probably just a little bit bigger than what's shown on the square footages on the legend on the side. So central office, one thing was kind of having that visibility, what we talked about during our past meetings. Looking at the footprint of Van Allen, a sense if that central office was located on the corner where you could get more visibility. It's a relatively busier street here. Good access to the site, from the east and south there. Again, the central office about 6,500 square feet. So that's kind of what we're showing here. And then central receiving. Central receiving kind of on the north side here of Van Allen. Graphically, I did lay in, one option was have a loading dock for central receiving. And then just looking at the overall site, that loading dock wall is about 50 feet, and then there's about 150 feet or so from that loading dock to the end of the paving, and there's still more space just from a truck standpoint. Maneuverability, I know that's one key issue at their existing site, because they can't get a semi in there and they can take the tractor out to the road and bring it back, and things like that. So this does have a little bit of an addition to it for a loading dock, just from a higher volume standpoint, if they are backing a truck up to it. So that's kind of what the farthest green box there represents. And then, again, just from a square footage, just looking at around 8,000 square feet, maybe what does that look like on the existing plan? So that's what we're showing there. Wisdom Quest is about 5,000 square feet, so taking about 5 existing classrooms plus a bank of restrooms. Again, this doesn't address all circulation, entrance, all that stuff, just a square footage standpoint. And then the homeschool function is in blue. That's kind of taking the existing media center, and kind of this front office area for homeschool, and that's came up to about 3,200 square feet is when we just looking at the space needs programming. And then the maintenance building up here is right around 9,400 square feet. So again, that's what that block is representing. And then the gray is just really just showing potential paving. I mean, whether you pave everything, or just kind of give a sense of the scale of the site, you know, what we're working with there. So, and again, you have off-street parking on the west side, and then as well in here, which could easily be transformed into off-street parking as well. I took the parking stalls out. I think I had 50 stalls or so laid out in there, just to see how that fits. So that's the option of taking some of those support services and repurposing Van Allen. Of course, it all ties into other options as well, as Vitus will talk about. So.
All right, so yeah, just probably should have prefaced this. One of the things we're going to talk about next is elementary schools and whether or not there's options to build new schools to replace existing schools. So the thought process here was if you are going to be vacating some of the existing facilities, does it make sense to think about, can those facilities continue to be used for an ongoing purpose? So of all the elementaries we looked at, Van Allen seemed to rise to the top as far as size of building, location, size of site. So that was really the logic behind studying, could we be more cost effective and not build a massive new central services building, and could you potentially reuse one of your existing? And we thought of the elementary buildings that could possibly be vacated, this one made the most sense from a site size and the size of the site. The other thing that we thought about, and it may or may not be real critical, but we showed needing to use the gym. This is the larger of the gyms that you have. So again, whether that's held aside for community shared use for after-school programs or community programs, we thought gym space is at a premium. I mean, if you really wanted to, probably get the yellow box to fit within that square footage and not build that maintenance section. But anyway, it's just an idea of testing how could we potentially best reuse some existing space, which of the buildings might make the most sense. So before we jump into the next section, are there any thoughts or questions about sort of the priority of the bus and transportation facility, or trying to get the central office out of the lease space? Or, we thought it also made sense to try to pull the alternative school and the homeschool program maybe to one of the other attendance centers. Maybe it comes out of the high school, maybe it stays in town, if we can reuse one of the facilities. So we do want to try to keep this conversational and get your feedback as we go through each of these sections. So anybody have any initial comments about the two different scenarios to address the bus, so this aging bus building and the aging central receiving building?
I know for me, you'll probably get my comments at the end, as it all just kind of soaks in. I don't know about anybody else, and I don't know about the community. I see we have a ton of community members here today, but
This is the best one.
well, I think it's very important, and I'm disappointed that there's not.
Well, we didn't brand this as a community meeting. I mean, I talked about it on the radio a lot, but I didn't send anything out. This was going to be a smaller site committee meeting.
Right.
Okay, so we'll move on, and maybe it probably does make sense to kind of see all the, and these are just testing different ideas. We might like some options from this and other options from others, and in the end, we want to try to get to what makes the most sense for, let's get the priorities first, and then let's figure out sort of what the phase-in sequencing will look like, and what are the other dollars there to support those decisions.
It is humorous that we could send central office back to where it once was. Because that's really what it was.
Yeah.
That's not very true. Well, those were the district offices in that corner of the building, so.
Full circle. Okay, so the next section we're going to talk about is the elementary schools. And we're going to talk about two different kind of big picture ideas. as I mentioned before, you could stay the status quo and try to continue using and maintaining. All 4 of your elementaries are of an age that they'll probably, you want to start thinking ahead about what's the end date for those, and there are some overcrowding issues. So the other thing that when we look at new elementary schools, there's some optimal sizes. You know, your elementary schools are ranging from, I want to say, about 120 on the small side, around 100 in Salem, into the 200s. So you have 4 attendance centers that you're staffing, or heating, cooling. In my experience, sort of the sweet spot for the size of an elementary, just in terms of quality education, efficiency, staffing, is in the 400 to 500 student range. We have seen elementaries that get much larger, up to 800 students, and you start to get some challenges with things like how many gymnasiums do you have, and how are you doing PE and lunch when you're trying to serve that many kids. So sort of as a frame of reference, we've seen some real successful elementary schools that are in that 400 student range. So one idea would be to take 4 existing elementaries that are all closer to 200 and you could do this all at once, or you could do it in 2 phases, and basically replace those with 2 new elementary schools that would be in about that 400 student range. So when we looked at this scenario, we thought, well, what's the most logical order to do that if you don't want to try to do it all at once? If you want to start with 1 new elementary, get that up and running, and then think about phasing in the second one later. From the assessment, we thought that Lincoln and Salem were probably the most challenging of the 2 elementaries in terms of age and condition and overcrowding, just the stuff that Cindy went over at the beginning of the meeting. So in this scenario, the first phase might look at building the first of those 2 elementary schools. And in this scheme, we're thinking that these would stay more like what you have today, which I would call a neighborhood school. They might not be quite as neighborhood related, but it would be a kindergarten through 5th grade scenario. So you would have 2 different elementary schools that ultimately keep the grades kindergarten through 5th grade all together for that experience. So the first elementary would be a 3-section kindergarten through 5th grade. And we went through all of the numbers of your existing students when we came up with these sizes. 400 students for that first building would accommodate both the students at Lincoln and Salem. Now, you may not have a 1-for-1 swap of where those kids go, but mathematically, it gives you room for a little bit of growth in that first school. I think between those 2 schools you're serving, and I'm just going by memory, but it's probably around 350 kids.
Yep.
So that'll give you a little, kind of address some of your growing, your square footage issues. So that, from a programmatic standpoint, that building would be in the neighborhood of about 56,000 square feet. So we're just trying to give you sort of options, and then, you know, once you narrow in on these, we can start to talk about more logistics, like where would a site be, or what would those things look like. Then the second phase, and whether that's 5 to 10 years down the road, or 3 to 6 years, I mean, it would seem to make sense to do one, get the kids moved, and then depending on your funding and your timeline, then to do the second one after that. So that second building would be, you know, elementary number 2. Again, it would serve pre-K all the way through 5th grade. In this case, we've got pre-K is currently at Van Allen, and of the elementaries, we think that one's probably got the most longevity left in it, and most size. So those preschoolers would stay at Van Allen while the first one's done. So the second building would be a pre-K through 5 building. 5 years down the road, your enrollment trends may go up a little bit, they may stay steady, they may continue down. So you can make the decision at that time as to whether that's a 3-section building or a 4-section building. If you had some growth, you could plan for that growth, with this being the second of the schools that you look at. So we're looking at that building serving anywhere from 400 to 550 students. And if it was on the larger, if it was the 4-section size, it would be a building of approximately 73,000 square feet. And that building would essentially replace Van Allen and Harlan. So when we kind of think back about the conversation we had about central offices, if Van Allen's the better of the buildings, you know, maybe the move for some of those support services is kind of a little later in the process. All right, so that's the first scenario. Replace 4 old buildings with 2 new buildings and keep all kindergarten and 5th grades together. do it in a phased process.
So if you run cost-wise, what would be an approximate cost?
I've got a little cheat sheet that's.
And going back to the moving central receiving the bus garage and all that to Van Allen, just out of curiosity, a building of that size.
So, the option one on the central office, which was to get all of the support services together, just do it once and get everybody together, that was probably in the, I'm gonna say $8 to $10 million range.
And that would be building a new,
Everything new, brand new bus bar.
brand new everything.
That would be, yeah. Did I get that right?
Any thoughts in comparison to redoing Van Allen? Is there thoughts on that?
Did you have that?
Yeah, it's a very, I had that at about 8 million.
Okay. What was the first one with the new building?
8 to 10. Was there anyone on? Okay.
Is that correct?
Yeah, so I mean, it was listing approximately 2 million for the new, if there was actually a new maintenance building,
Right.
and about 6 million to do all of the renovation, repurposing, get those programs in there. Which again, I think that cost could range, depending on if you just move in or if you really sort of take walls down and reconfigure.
So what's that about the bus line? Because if we're looking at refurbish the ground, what's the cost of the bus line on top of that? If you're comparing to the whole new facility.
The new bus barn was in the $4 to $5 million range. Okay. So the 8 to 10 million for the all-new facility may be a tad shy. I think it's really based on the enclosed space, so there may be some added cost to get that extra. We talked about that extra 18,000 for all the covered space, so it's indicating about 30,000 square feet versus the 47, 48. So we can get back to you on sort of what the extra cost of all that covered.
Excuse me, that would be after Van Allen. I mean, in other words, that wouldn't be taken care of for maybe 10 years.
Correct. So the other, and that's a great point. As we develop these scenarios, we'll also want to be thinking about what does cost escalation look like? What's that cost 5 years or 10 years from now? But yeah, good point.
And I suppose with the space that's there, you could go ahead and move the bus barn almost immediately, which I think is a very important thing. Am I correct?
Absolutely, you're right on the money. I think if you did that option, you would try to find a new home for the bus maintenance in the short term, and you would kind of hold off and tread water on the other option, the other support services until Van Allen opens up. And again, this is just an idea. I mean, you could say, we want to move into Lincoln, or we don't want to move into any of these buildings, but we thought we'd give you a scenario where let's see what the best use for salvaging one of those buildings would be, which one's got the most site and is closest in town.
Thank you for clearing that up.
No, those are great questions, thank you. Okay, so, other questions before we, well, something, I can give you elementary school costs, and again, these would be in today's dollars. So, the first elementary, which was the 400 student, in the order of magnitude of $20 million. And then the second school might be closer to 26. And again, we would need to adjust for how many years down the road that would be for cost escalation. Those would be in today's dollars. Those elementaries would be in the $20 to $25 million range.
And I'm sorry, I said I wasn't going to cause trouble. Okay. No, I have, just to clear things up, are most of the students at Salem, are they rural students? I
Yes.
mean, they're already being transported quite a distance?
I believe that maybe you
Or
guys can address
are
that.
there a lot of local in the town?
I don't know how many live right there in town, but 100 students at Salem, and about half of them are open enrolled from other school district. So it's about 50 of our resident students, some from in town, some from outside of town, and then about half of them.
So basically, most of the elementary students would, you know, I'm old enough that I still I remember neighborhood schools. But most of them already, even in town, are being transported by bus, am I correct?
In town, not so much by bus, but by
By
parents
parents.
bringing them to school, which is a huge challenge that we have been talking about as well, is, you know, if you do anything new or renovate, pickup and drop off is a huge issue at all the elementaries and at the middle school.
Okay, thank you.
And maybe, I hope I'm going to say this right, but I think at Salem, as far as transportation, it's also sort of a regional collector. So there may be kids that are middle school aged that need to go there first and catch a transfer and then come into town. And then the middle school is also a transfer location. So there may be more transportation coming through Salem than just the rural students in that area. All right, you ready for option number 2?
You're on.
Okay, so second scenario would be to think about the possibility of, let's see here.
This one, these, option number 1 was added
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, that's why my slide looks like I so
So not ready for option two.
sorry. So, option 1 assumes you continue to use the middle school. I mean, there's been a lot of investment in that building. It's an older building, but it's actually pretty cool in terms of how it's been preserved and added on to. It's centrally located. So, one of the things that came up in the discussion about the middle school that is lacking is, you know, there is a lack of gym space. Some of the kids are walking down to the Cottrell gym. It doesn't have a wrestling room or fitness space that is a little more appropriate for middle school age. So this scenario would again say we've got middle school's working, we'll stay where it's at. But if we want to try to address the issue of the lack of some of that support space, we're of the opinion the bus barn's got to go. We got to do something no matter what there. That site is closer to the middle school, it's within a block. So you could conceive of some sort of very cost-effective pre-engineered metal building, maybe that's a practice gym, fitness wrestling space, and that could be anywhere from 10 to 15,000 square feet. Would probably fit well on that site. It would be a closer option for the middle school. So that's another thing that we're thinking about to try to address one of the larger concerns that came up at the middle school.
Just out of curiosity, size-wise and footprints, could that building possibly go to the tennis court area, on the left-hand side, be the northwest corner?
Potentially, yeah. The
My
tennis courts are northwest.
Walking back school kids, a couple blocks away.
So you're saying right up in
Better
here.
access.
There is some concern though with that area that's old fill. I don't know if there was houses there or what, but it's a sinking area.
Well, it seems to me like you guys just put some money in this for pickleball courts, right? Well, it was just a thought of like, okay, we're going to be vacating district-owned property, so maybe you just sell that, but if it's close to the middle school, and so, you know, food for thought. You know, we're doing a project for another district, so they just need some extra JV practice. You know, it's a very cost-effective pre-engineered metal building. It could be opened up for community use, wrestling when it's wrestling season, and other activities. So, just an idea. Okay, so the next slide is kind of a flow chart. I won't necessarily, and this is just kind of trying to diagram this option. You know, in the first 5 years, you look at
What, 10 to 15,000 or 13,000 square foot on something like that, what would be the cost on today's salary? 5.2.
Okay, so this is just kind of graphically showing you what we just walked through. First new kindergarten through 5th grade building, close Lincoln, close Salem, continue to keep Van Allen and Harlan in operation. In this scenario, you could consider a new support services building or a new bus facility. And then in years 5 through 10, you would have that second elementary school, which would require the closure of Harlan and potentially closure or repurposing of Van Allen. So if you did choose the repurposing of Van Allen, that would be to the relocated facilities rather than the all new facilities. And then these, those functions, all or some combination of them could potentially be talked about for Van Allen. So let's kind of think ahead how we want to most easily communicate these various options if we want to get some additional surveys or community input on how these might work.
So on that, was there a thought of where you do, say, this phase one, close, Lincoln, Salem?
We haven't started to look at what property might be appropriate or any of that. We're just thinking programmatically what makes sense to replace first. So my initial thoughts is you would probably look for an appropriate site somewhere reasonably within town, or near town.
But in the 1 to 5 up there, you're starting with new kindergarten fifth. So that doesn't get you to, because you have to have if you're closing Lincoln, Salem, you still got to use Van Allen as an elementary building.
And Harlan.
It's new to be in Harlan. So then all of those support services are coming, repurposing Van Allen for support services is coming later in the.
Yeah, so I see some pros and cons to that. You're having to wait longer to repurpose it, but the reason we're continuing to use it for elementary is because it's the largest and it's in the best shape as far as operational costs and energy costs and those sorts of things. So in this scenario, you would maybe look at just the bus maintenance building as part of that first 1 to 5 year. And again, these are very general. You can do these you do the first project within the next 2 years, and you can do the next one 2 or 3 years later. The time frame is fairly general, but we kind of organize these so that you can consider them in phases. The first phase being anywhere in the 1 to 5 time year, and the second being more longer term view of potentially 5 to 10 years. And some of that will get, once we get your feedback and the community's feedback on priorities, some of that may be informed by the financing side. You may not want to spend this much money in the first round. So that will inform. So do we need to wait to year 8 to consider the second round of projects? Okay, so the next scenario is something different. So this is looking at the idea of a new middle school. And I think the campus, the size of the site here, there was probably some forethought that this was purchased big enough to do a high school and a middle school campus. So we thought, let's test that idea out, and how would that impact your other decisions. So first notion here is you would build the new middle school on the south side of this campus. So then you've got the existing middle school open for use. It's a pretty cool building. We were thinking of testing the idea with the community. Some communities like whole grade facilities, so they'll have all 6 sections go together for kindergarten through 2nd grade, and then all 6 sections of kids will move to the next building, and they'll be together 3rd through 5th grade, and they'll go to middle school, and then they'll go to high school. So I would say it's kind of it's a pretty even split. The schools we work with that either do 2 or 3 quote neighborhood schools that have a full range of elementary versus having the kids stay together all the way through their educational experience, and we've got them together. So this is just testing. You wouldn't have to do it this way, but we wanted to throw that idea out. So in this scenario, we thought it would make most sense to put the upper elementary into the middle school. So that would be grades 3 through 5. And then in phase 2, we would look at constructing a new elementary school. So if you move the 3rd and 5th graders into the existing middle school, I think initially our thought was you could probably continue to use Salem. Salem would be it could go one way or the other. It could go in the first move or it could go in the second. For the purpose of this discussion, we thought you would only close Lincoln, and you would move all of the kids from Lincoln, Harlan, and Allen that are 3rd through 5th graders, all together would go to middle school. That would give you, I want to say, 300, I'm not sure if I have that number with me, but you got plenty of room. I mean, you could ultimately fit all 3 grade levels in the end, and you would be saving kids in as well. So then, in order to serve, you would then continue to use Salem, Van Allen, and Harlan until that second phase, whether that's 4 years, 5 years, 6 years down the line. But when you're ready to build the new early elementary school, you would construct a new facility that would be a pre-K, kindergarten through 2nd grade. It would be the first, sort of the first impression of kids coming into the district. We're also working with a lot of districts that are partnering with other community groups to do early childhood programs where there might be some daycare options or support before and after. And they're having some success of kids that are coming in to the district as 3-year-olds or 2-year-olds. It sort of gets them in the door, and that would be your newest and nicest facility. It would be sort of the first impression of kids coming to want to maintain and stay with the district. So that facility would be a 6-section pre-K through 2nd grade, would be able to serve about 500 students. And essentially it would be in the neighborhood of 68,000 square feet. And then ultimately when all of the middle school kids are at, all of the 3rd through 5th graders are at middle school, that would be about 430 students. So the math works out really well in terms of the size of that building and how many kids it can serve. It's right at the projected number that would be appropriate for those grade levels. So I think we've got another graphic that just, this is very generic, so don't grade us on our architecture here. This is just, what does a 95,000 square foot box look like? And now to see if this is an option, we start to look at how to configure that. It might even have some 2-story sections in that, as large as that, but
Would you not somehow connect it?
you could look at that kind of a, I know like Dallas Center has some, where they built their middle school next to the high school and they have a connector. You could certainly look at that as an option.
If you're looking at gym space and that kind of thing, anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I think if this is a scenario you have interest in it, I know there was some additional master planning done when they built this building that, if you ever did want some additional supporting athletic facilities, you'll still have your Maple Leaf complex, but you may want to have some practice fields or other things out there. So we want to evaluate all of those things together as far as where this goes and where those different outdoor support spaces might go.
I've noticed, that the proposal is an auditorium in the years after this, 10 years. Would it be better maybe to have an auditorium between the 2 facilities, between the middle school and the high school, that could be used then easily by both?
Yes, that would certainly be an option. I think
If I understand what John was saying about wanting maybe closer because of the gymnasium, but the gymnasium use is a little different in between high school and middle school also. So were you thinking of a smaller or medium-sized gymnasium in the middle school?
probably the standard.
The standard.
I mean, it would be a full-size gym that would be able to handle
But
it.
maybe not as much seating.
Yes, the seating capacity would be lower for middle school. The auditorium discussion, we're not telling you that should be a 1 to 5 year or 5 to 10, but that's where we put it just from a costing perspective. But if the community says, hey, auditorium's a really key deal,
Community needs it.
we want that now, that's your decision to make as to if it's a priority when it goes. We did look at the construction for the original high school, and they did master plan. This would be aside from thoughts about whether there's a connected middle school or an auditorium between them, but it was master plan. We'll get there in this location. And part of that is, a lot of times we see auditoriums that have some connectivity to band and choir rooms because they flow and they work out. So the design of the school, those music programs are in that area. So there is a little bit of logic to how they they master planned it, but again, if that's ultimately where the process leads, we can look at a variety of options of Auditorium Middle School and how those are connected or not connected. Okay, so the flow chart for this option is really, you need to start with looking at the construction of a new middle school. We would continue to keep Salem open, Harlem open, and Van Allen. Repurpose the existing middle school for grades 3 through 5. And then potentially close, or there may be some other scenario if you wanted to look at whether Lincoln makes sense to do some things like central receiving or central office. Lincoln, in our opinion, is, from the first discussion, is probably higher on the address that one in the first phase as opposed to the second. So if that is ultimately where you go, you're gonna have to think about what do we want to do with that building. So we forgot. And then the second phase would be the new early education center for pre-K second, and that would involve moving Harlan and Salem and Van Allen into that, those early grade levels into that building.
We've definitely had some conversation over grade line buildings. We obviously had conversations about how that impacts instruction and consistent
Collaboration.
construction, resources needed. So we definitely have been having those conversations. And we've sought feedback of staff members and really talked a lot about it outside of kind of community discussions, but definitely as a board, we've had those discussions. We understand definitely some of the benefits of going grade like.
And in all of these scenarios, we think you're getting a very efficient operational, 400 to 500 student size. If you really like the idea of grade alike, but you like the idea of building 2 elementaries versus building a middle school, you could apply the same theory to that in terms of how you realign grades. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Davey and talk about some of the high school cases, unless you want to.
Costs, move on to costs for a new middle school and a new early elementary.
Okay, so the new middle school scenario, it was about 95,000 square feet and somewhere in the neighborhood of 33 to 35 million, I would say. And these are today's dollars. And so these elementaries were
The new elementary.
the 68,000, 26.9, so about 27 million.
Keep in mind, these were definitely, very rough numbers at this point in time. These were design.
Order of magnitude for this. What's it usually
Is some of the increased costs of repurposing, say, Van Allen, is that because we have to, since we're touching the building, fire sprinklers, ADA, all that stuff, is gonna have pretty good increased cost. Is there a percentage on that added cost for retrofitting?
Cindy addressed that, but I think.
Over
we'll
just
figure some of
state
that.
building?
Sometimes it does cost more to repurpose it, because you have to work around existing features and functions. As far as the code upgrades, it really depends on if you're having students in there. The occupancy affects the code requirements, and so if there were no students in there and it was a business occupancy, that would trigger certain things. If you had students in there, it would trigger the fire alarm. So I guess the answer is it depends. It depends on what you're trying to land on, but these numbers are based on a renovation project that I just bid last month. And the market is pretty volatile right now, and we're hoping that it will level out and decrease in the future.
All right. Any other thoughts before we jump over to the high school?
So at the high school site here, we kind of looked at 4 different areas of work, just either additions or renovations. I mean, the big thing we kind of already talked about was the egg program, that there's already been some movement or excitement in the community to do that. Again, I think during our walkthrough, you know, even just from a placing it in a school standpoint, we kind of have it, you know, this is turned a little bit, but it's all on the northeast side there. Roughly 3,000 square feet for the egg program. And then one thing that we did, maybe didn't come out of the facility assessment, was the whole secure entry piece to the high school. So we added that on here graphically, you know, obviously at the entrance here. It works out well, and it does tie into the kind of the central office admin area right here. So just a little.
Office first before you get into the rest of the.
Correct. Yeah, it's kind of a control point, particularly when, like, after school starts. You don't want every kid coming through the office, but when visitors and people are coming to the school, it's a point. You know, they may be able to get into the secure entry, but they still have to get either buzzed in or, you know, into the office area. So we just kind of filled this, you know, kind of where the existing entrance is there with the idea of a secure entry. And again, as Vitus was talking about on the original high school drawings, master planning, there was a spot here for the auditorium, you get right off the band, you know, oval area here. So we got that 25,000 square feet. And then from our facilities assessment meeting last month, we talked about the CTE upgrade. So right now it's just blocked in as a square footage for renovation. But I mean, if you're needing more program space, there could be an addition as well to that space. Right now we just kind of took the existing, at least the welding wood shop area. I guess we didn't get down into the engineering, I think, computer design lab, but this is just taking mostly the shop function area in the high school. You know, it's roughly 7,400 square feet for a potential upgrade to those spaces.
That was one we need more discussion. We didn't flag it during the walkthrough, but the board meeting was brought up that there may be some need for improvement. So if that's of interest, that's one we would need some further feedback from you on what really is needed to design there.
So this, again, just showing the option of taking the wisdom quest in the homeschool functions. Again, just showing kind of what those square footages look like on the site. You know, potentially creating its own, you know, connected to the same building, and then offering some additional, you know, an option for additional, you know, street parking kind of dedicated to those two spaces. I mean, looking at the site, you know, with the site to the south, you know, that option of the middle school athletic fields, you really don't want to tie up any of that potential space with the building or anything. So it's kind of why the placement of this. Again, this is just looking at the site and placing it on the site. So just to give an idea of what that box would look like.
Just to keep in mind as well, we talked about problematic nature of one way in, one way out for this facility or this area. We need to be addressed somehow.
Yeah, I think we started to comply with what you need.
Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
I don't know if that's as easy as this.
Yeah, I tried to think through that other connection point, the access point to there. Obviously, if you had a middle school up there, you definitely need another one, not two more, just to make everything work. So on the high school campus, looking at the improvements, and again, these are kind of similar to the elementary school between the 1 to 5 years and 5 to 10 years. And again, those are just for us to kind of make sense of it and put them in a location on here. But again, you could flip them, right? If the auditorium is a higher priority, you could easily move it around. So high school improvements that we looked at on that drawing is the new ag lab, renovating the CTE space, 1 to 5 year, and then the new high school auditorium in that 5 to 10 year range. And then the other two we looked at was the secure entrance addition. Again, they're all kind of in that 1 to 5 year. And then the Wisdom Quest homeschool building, and then that new middle school option. So again, a lot of moving parts and to kind of work through, but just to show you on the high school campus, because it is obviously the largest acreage that you have in the district, trying to make the best use out of that additional space.
It may be large enough that you, if you wanted to do a transportation building, 68 acres, it may be big enough to do all three, middle schools, transportation, and high school. Particularly because
Of an attendance center on the ground, you would need to expand parking as well.
yeah. But just from statistics of what a new high school would take for middle school, one of the reasons that a high school site is so much larger is it usually also accommodates your outdoor athletics. And you've got a lot of space tied up at Maple, sorry, I was going to say Maple Quest, but, I mean, I think when you really get down to maximizing the use of that site, you probably have more than enough room for a high school and a middle school. You could start looking at other things like the alternative school, homeschool, and transportation type facilities.
Yeah, I was just looking at from the assessment, kind of that recommended acreage. The middle school is 25 to 35. And we're looking at, 68 acres total for the high school, so.
I think he's got it in the first compared to our charts.
All right, are there any questions on that? I think we're going to jump into some of the Esser.
What's the cost for high school?
So, let's see, the new ag program is right around 800,000. The auditorium, the 25,000 square foot auditorium is 12.5 million. And then the CTE renovations, again, this is just kind of renovating to the existing footprint, was right around 1.7 million.
And we can, Cindy's worked all these up, we didn't want to focus on dollars today, but if you want those estimates, that we can give the things that you're all writing down.
Let's see, what the other one, did we talk about the middle school? Okay.
The only thing that would be a Wisdom Quest.
Okay, yeah, 3.3. Any other, I mean, obviously you can have questions at the end too pertaining to anything that we talked about, so.
My name's Dennis Morash, Bluestone Engineering, mechanical engineer, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Esser funding and some of the potential projects that could come from that. So this slide kind of does a good job of just defining the parameters that are associated with this money. There's kind of a couple of different things that you have to consider when you're using this. I mean, one of the big things is it's got to go towards improving indoor air quality. And there's a lot of different things that fall into that category in that definition. It can be just straight HVAC equipment. It can be if you're upgrading an HVAC system and it's you have to replace the ceiling, so that there's sort of a general construction cost to go along with that as well. And then there's also a series of testing and some other things that fall into that category. We have done some of the retrofit evaluation that kind of fought over that and helped identify some of the issues associated with various buildings. Again, I think the amount that we're looking at, as a potential amount to be able to use for some of this stuff is the $2.9 million. Another thing that considers it's got to be spent by June 30th of 2024. So that's again some of the parameters. And then also one of the things that kind of falls into these projects is there's prevailing wages that have to be met as well. So that does impact the cost of some of these projects. It does usually bump it up, maybe 15 to 20%. It's kind of the number that I usually kind of use just because you've got to use those higher wage rates associated with that. So I guess I kind of look at this as kind of your a la carte menu of all the things that we kind of identified as part of these projects. Just kind of talking through some of these on a very high level. At the high school, the boilers and pumps, those are something that is kind of getting into kind of life. There's an issue with those, so that'll be part of it. There's 4 air handling units that we'd be looking at upgrading and adding cooling to those. That includes the main gymnasium, the 2 locker rooms that are off there, and then also the wood shop area as well. One of the things that once you start touching some of these items is just upgrading the fire alarm to meet the current standards, so that would be something that would kind of fall in there. There's some miscellaneous HVAC repairs, and those are kind of, you'll see those in a couple of these different schools. That was something that's kind of identified as part of the commissioning process. They're ranged from everything from some basic controls components, just some sensors and some of those sorts of things. I guess is kind of what most of those are falling under. And then another thing that's kind of under a bunch of these different schools is filtration. Again, as part of the Esser, to improve indoor air quality. Most filters in HVAC equipment is a MERV 8, MERV 13. That's a higher level of filtration, and then basically you can put that cost associated with those as part of one of the Esser funding. Moving on to the middle school, there's a rooftop unit that's serving the cafeteria there. That's been some ongoing issues with that unit. So getting that unit upgraded so that it's functioning properly and bringing in correct amounts of ventilation. Again, the gymnasium at the middle school, that air handling unit currently does not have cooling in it, so we'll be adding cooling, and again, making sure that the ventilation rates are correct and current in there as well. There's some windows that have had some issues there as well, so that's part of that. Moving on to Van Allen, we've got some window issues there that we're looking at. The miscellaneous HVAC repairs and the filtration. We go to Harlan, so there's some steam boilers there as well that are kind of end of life, and that's also a steam system. We'd be looking at converting that over to a heating water system, which is a little bit more efficient and also, kind of newer technology. Again, the piping associated with that. We've got some fire alarm upgrades, some HVAC repairs and some filtration there. Salem is pretty minimal work. That facility is just kind of doing some testing and balancing to ensure that we're getting the right airflows to all the different spaces there. Moving on to Lincoln, so there's an existing rooftop unit there that we're looking at replacing. Again, some boilers there, the HVAC repairs and some filter upgrades, and then at Maple Leaf, looking at upgrading some of the HVAC there on the locker rooms to get that kind of stuff there as well. I don't know if there's any questions or comments on any of those items, or
I think this is the full a la carte list. You may start to strategize based on other decisions you make, and how much you want to invest in each one of those buildings. If that makes sense.
I have been curious about if we were going to condition the air in the high school and in the middle school with top units. What kind of cost figure do you think that would be?
yeah, I guess kind of the next slide has some of the bulk. That's like if you do everything in each one of those schools.
But specifically.
But specifically,
For the
yeah.
high school and the middle school, air conditioning them, for the high school, it's 900,000 approximately, and the middle school is 270.
Oh, okay. The 2 gymnasium spaces.
Yeah, the high school gym.
The high school gym, and the locker rooms, and that air handler 6, and the wood shop is
Yeah.
included in that.
Oh.
In the middle school is the cafeteria and the gym,
Okay, so just short of $1 million. What was the middle school again?
270.
And I guess one of the things that we're seeing right now, Cindy kind of alluded to this earlier, is we're seeing very high costs for equipment. And you know, the other thing is lead times on equipment is kind of out there quite a ways currently. So that's also something kind of, you know, we kind of taken into consideration as part of this.
Is it getting worse or better?
It's getting worse right now, I would say, so.
So the large equipment replacements, we're working on some projects that are Esser funded. We'll probably be on summer of 2022 to get those bid and ordered in time. So those, we still, if you wanted to do some of the bigger mechanical equipment upgrades, you'd probably target those for 2023, which is within the funding timeline. It was just, we're bidding projects literally like next week in Washington to make this summer's work based on lead times.
And that's probably pushing it into next year for some of that stuff.
We get the cost of like, these aren't going to go up like 20%.
I would suspect they would, you know, to be honest, I mean, they're rising higher faster than they should, so hopefully it slows, but I don't think it's going to come. We're going to see it.
We're going to see a big dip. I think it's going to hopefully stabilize.
Stabilize.
And Harlan and Lincoln, those numbers are so high because of the conversion from the steam boiler to the hot water boiler. It involves changing out the piping, so those two have similar issues.
Yeah, as you can see, if you add all the stuff up, it will exceed what your amount of money you could have. So that's kind of why, you know, looking at it as an a la carte and trying to pick things that you can afford or what your priorities are and pull those kind of items out and try to get those open as soon as possible, I guess.
The other number that I was curious about was, because we talked a lot about that air handler unit 2 at Lincoln that's just not functioning. What's it going to cost?
60,000 for that one.
This one is, when we were talking about the verbs, going from the 8 to 13. These costs don't include the increased costs associated with that, right?
What it does include is the physical filters for 1 year, assuming that you're changing them out every 3 months. And then once the COVID scare is over, you use the normal filters and then your normal energy usage.
And again, this is kind of just a very, you know, basic timeline of, you know, if you're doing schoolwork and trying to get done in the summer, so what is something that's, you know, maybe feasible to try to get done before this upcoming summer, and then, you know, how do we deal with that? And I think these were just some of the projects that we identified maybe as higher priorities and stuff that we could get, you know, for next summer this year and get those. So the rooftop unit at Lincoln that we talked about, the furnaces that we believe, boilers, and then some of the miscellaneous mechanical items that were identified as part of the retro commissioning process.
The things like, you have the high school boilers, Maple Leaf furnace, and those aren't going to be Esser eligible, are they?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, if you read through that whole description of like what things are eligible, you know, and I think we can justify that those things, you know, by having your boilers that can function, you know, at 100% capacity or that they're capable of full operation, that does tie back to like maybe ensuring that you have enough ventilation in some of those spaces. You know, if you have boilers that are failing or they're not working to that capacity, maybe they're not bringing in the correct amount of outside air. So we can kind of, it's justifying, you know, this supports the HVAC equipment, so we can, you know, allot that towards the Esser side of things. We've had kind of several different discussions about that, you know, and I think if you group the boiler project with, you know, upgraded air handling units, you know, then I would say for sure that's really not a question at all with that. It's just doing that separately maybe is, you know, maybe it takes a little bit more justification to ensure that they can use the Esser funding for that.
A lot of these items may just be ongoing maintenance, medical type things that you want to fund as needed.
Sure, yeah, I just didn't, you know, I never standalone, I wouldn't think that boilers would be able to last from my review.
Yeah, we worked with some districts that they were allocated a certain amount, and they're trying to figure out, this is a funding source that's been made available to us, how do we best use it? So they're trying to fit projects that fit any of the categories. So some do that just out of routine maintenance, some try to maximize the use of the rest of dollars as they have them. And those projects, like Dennis mentioned, usually want to be bid separate from another, like a general construction, because they do have a Davis Bacon prevailing wage, so we try to review those, we try to package them, so we're just focused on a mechanical upgrade, or we're just focused on a window replacement.
And if I could add to that, we're doing a project in Keokuk right now, and it includes boilers, and it was approved.
Was and HVAC was part of that as well?
It was a whole system, and so the boilers were part of the system,
I
as
see.
Dennis alluded to. But potentially, if we look at it as two timelines, if you look at the next slide, if we break it up into kind of two projects, boilers have a very short lead time, and so it was one thing that we could do. If we submit it as, we're doing it this summer, and then chiller next summer, it's all part of, or the air conditioners, it's all part of the same system.
So basically what I'm hearing is you can tie the boilers into the Esser funds because you potentially will need to constantly cool more of that outside air coming in.
Right.
Therefore, it qualifies for ventilation, which is the Esser side. Is that what I'm hearing?
Right.
Well, particularly if you have a two-phase project, we're doing boilers phase one, we're doing air dampers phase two, but it's all part of one big project that's trying to get our system upgraded as a whole. So I guess maybe that concludes the various master planning options we have for today. There's certainly opportunities to discuss other options, but we wanted to get several different scenarios that we think hit the highlights that we heard during the assessment, and then we can talk about next steps after this. So I guess maybe we'll open it up for Q&A before we go into next steps. Our thoughts, just, we threw a lot of different ideas at you. I know you guys have been eager to hear them.
I've got a lot of kind of.
I think one thing we need to focus on sooner than later is our Esser priorities, just to go back shelf life. That's coming sooner than later. I mean, that's all things to be decided. I mean, have some discussion, put some bags on the board.
And we,
Esser's going to come up sooner than later.
it is, and that's when Sydney asked for, available dollars. We're going to have to be real. We need to be very careful about how we plan for that, because we are. I mean, to the learning gap that COVID created and some of the social emotional pieces that we've been able to address using Esser have been some staffing additions that we know, we know we're using one-time money for that right now. So we just need to be very careful about how we proceed and how we budget all of that appropriately. Anyway.
Yeah, I think to that point, there's usually a certain percentage, and it varies for closing the learning gap. And then there's some percentage that many districts want to try to spend on air quality improvements.
I don't know, on the master planning side of things, obviously, I think we definitely have to look at how we utilize this area. Obviously, we already own it, so, I don't think we can feasibly find two additional sites to build new buildings on and not utilize the area we have out here first.
One thing that comes up for me, one of the challenges some of our staff face this with elementaries, one of the challenges is some of our support staff. instructional coaches, nurses, sped, Title I, they're spread on 4 different elementaries. You know, getting them down to 2 helps that utilization a little bit, but it's still not as good as 1. But also there's a research, and John and Katie, you guys can jump in with not so much greater like elementary, but the K through 2, the 3 through 5. If we were to look at 2 different buildings, and that's the direction we want to head.
Yeah, you know, a lot of those support staff and functions, as I mentioned, you know, 400 student elementary is more cost effective than 200 elementary for all those exact reasons, and
Let's maintain. We're sort of doing costs and meeting costs are.
is this what you guys were looking for? I mean, I know we were kind
It
of
is.
holding you off to do the assessment first, but I think this was really the discussion you guys were wanting to get to.
I think it's important to think about as well. I mean, when you're talking about, you know, whether it's a new middle school or new elementary buildings, I mean, those are going to have to be voter-approved projects. And so as you're, I have just always, my own thinking, have thought, those projects that need to be more voter friendly to get that approval, maybe you start with a phase that where you're bonding against you know where you're doing revenue bonds against your saved dollars, and it then shows our community that yes, we have a plan and we're moving forward, and so you get a visual of the progressive nature, and to show some commitment to it, and so I don't know. That's just what I had thought, is you push the ball and get the ball rolling down the hill a little bit with you know bonding against those saved dollars.
Well, I think there may be some strategy or thoughts about, and obviously I think our next step is to kind of let you guys absorb this information. Maybe at your next board meeting, there's just an update for the rest of the board members. You know, maybe it's just a summary that's given, not a full-on presentation. But I think we ought to try to get some of the things that you guys think we're on the right path, sort of packaged into some sort of a community survey. It could be, rank what you think is to be your number one priorities: building a new middle school, replacing the elementary schools, building a new ag, replacing the bus and transportation building. I think the things that I'm guessing that the community is going to be more passionate about are things like the new ag program, the new elementary school,
Of course, yeah.
developing the middle school. You may not get people saying, hey, the bus barn's my number one priority, I want to see you spend $5 million on that. So some of those projects may be more,
Yeah.
we're just saving up, you know, that's more routine facilities projects. They're not the big bond question or the top priority.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's all, and that's what I was thinking was that's why you basically you just had, you know, it's a public hearing test, or having a public hearing on bonding, you know, against some of those saved dollars, but you do, we need the facilities, and it starts to build some momentum. Maybe I'm off on it. I don't know.
I think the only other thing that we've been talking about as the first step, obviously, is not to continue to lease, but none of these options showed a real solution for district offices until 10, 15 years down the road.
I think the only comment I would have to that is unless you prioritize building a new central services building, we try to get all of the central services together. We try to take care of the bus garage and the central office and the central receiving all together.
And in option 2, plan on this repurposed 5 to 10 years sooner than option 1.
I was just gonna say, is there room here
there's something that, as you said, the general public's gonna overlook, and why do we want to spend money on that? But they desperately need something. And as an option, could it come out here? Could a building my size with maintenance, the bus barn, central office, central receiving, could that all be located out here?
To your question, I suspect when you get down to doing an actual full on-site analysis, you probably would have enough room to do some sort of central services building and a middle school on the site.
Because I think ideally that would be where we want to do, but I think that's a priority, and so, but we don't want to have to go out and look for a place to do this.
Yeah, I don't, with all of this,
Yeah. What do you do when you vacate four buildings? Or have four buildings? The city's not going to buy four more elementary school buildings. No.
What's your experience?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a variety of things from, you know, somebody buys it for $1 and takes on a repurposing project. Sometimes the in-school, the in-town, on a block, city block, has some more real estate value than the building value, so somebody might see potential for redevelopment of the site into additional family homes or things like that. Sometimes it's a little harder to just find somebody to buy the building to move in. I don't know if you've got other community organizations that are looking for that kind of space, if there's some Christian schools or daycare programs or senior centers. I mean, got other community type of functions, but those sometimes are a little harder to find a partner than just what's the value of the real estate and land, what's its highest and best use for the community moving forward.
You know, one thing I look at with that, if we were to spend money on the fitness center in the middle school, going back earlier in the chart, you know, where you look at what our current utilization is on space per student, we're expected to run neck to neck. You know, we put money into that building and we go up, now we're overutilizing that building. With that said, that was, let's say we go to a new middle school, the current middle school became an elementary building. Is there enough room there, and what's the projected cost to get that ready, if any, for an elementary school?
That's a good question. I don't think we really assigned a lot of cost for switching from 6-8 to 3-5, but there may be some. And the building's been very well maintained. There's a few things, you know, there was a sort of a laundry list in our assessment of small things to take care of, retaining walls and some leaks in the roofs, those sorts of things.
We had to put a fence up. Yeah. We had to put a fence up.
Is there a concern, if, let's say you did that, I mean, there's at least 4 different levels to that building, and classrooms at every level.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be worth some further study. I mean, I was just kind of thinking, you may have a 5th grade pod on the 3rd floor, a 4th grade pod on the 2nd floor, and a 3rd grade pod, and then you may do some of the other specials, or you may need to spread them out a little bit more, but you do kind of have those kind of individual floor plans that you need to think about what's the best way to use those. So that was the first thing that popped into my mind without spending a whole lot of time trying to sort of assign who would be in which rooms.
Even this way though, think how much better it'd be 3rd through 5th grade movie in that building. Burn off some energy.
I think as far as the ability to, I think that building's large enough, you have room to grow. I mean, when you look at the planning standard for middle school, it's closer to 190 square feet per student. Because there's a few more things that elementary schools don't have, you know, more band room or a bigger gym, for example. The planning standards we were looking at for the elementaries is around 140. So at 190 square feet per student, your ability to serve 430 kids is right there. If you're switching to elementary, I think you'll have more room to grow than you might think. And again, a lot of these decisions, you know, we show the demographics charts. you're declining slightly, and you're fairly stable, but the trend is slightly down. So we want to make sure we're not sort of overbuilding for growth that, if it doesn't come, we don't have to build for growth that's not there. Which is part of the strategy of thinking about phasing, like take care of some immediate needs now, see where growth is, and you can plan for bigger buildings if you need them, or at the time you do those, if enrollment's steady or declining, and do a smaller project in the second phase.
If you go back to the repurposing of that home, that was easy. As far as like the parking spaces, what did you calculate?
I think Damien actually had some very detailed spreadsheets that had parking counts programmatically for each of these. I don't know if you want.
Yeah, I laid, let's see. So we had 50, for the central office, there's 50 parking stalls noted on there. And then I had laid that out. I mean, I had parking stalls, like just rectangles on that plan. I ended up just taking them off, but on the east side there, I kind of laid some out there. I mean, it went into the grass area to the north, but, trying to show some, or seeing how some off-street parking would fit there. But you still have a lot, I mean.
Quite a bit existing here.
Yeah.
How much of this is developed for transportation and receiving? We chose this site because it was the biggest of the four, and it would allow the most opportunity for off-street parking or service vehicle maneuvering, deliveries and so forth.
And again, for the Van Allen site, it's just shy of like 5 acres. So think about this site, we're 68 acres, just from a scale standpoint. All those functions fit on there. Well, in the computer, we fit on there graphically, right? That 5 acre site, we less than 5 acres. So, it doesn't have to bus stuff on it, but all the other, support staff functions. And then it still has, square footage left over that's not utilized with that space. So we're taking up, I don't know, add it up, but, Van Allen's, roughly 40,000 square feet. So you still have a little chunk there that's not used for support spaces. I think the biggest, probably one of the bigger challenges here is the central receiving. How would, you think about how they utilize that existing classroom. Obviously not walls down, but intended with additional structure, things like that, and volume-wise, so, it's kind of the, probably, because it's not really an office function, right? It's wants to be an open space and wide aisles and get moved around, so.
My curiosity is from central office staff, Chad, you guys, what's your thoughts on something like this?
Supply type stuff. I'm just trying to think about, like, you're talking about loading docks. I know a lot of our stuff we use in vans, a lot of that stuff, so definitely part without loading docks. I would like to actually see the maintenance shed move closer somehow. And maybe not just tucked back there in the corner, but yeah, I mean, nothing that really big.
To be honest, I think if we had everybody together, it would be great, but I'm missing transportation.
Yep.
I think if you go towards Fairfield, I think that they have everything all in one place. Because we talk a lot. And I would like to see change a lot. I mean, I would like to see all of that. This is just too long. Correct.
First thing you pull in is you see that central office. The bus park back here. And the maintenance and bus park back here. I don't know.
Again, we're the first people that new families took this right down the street. So we need to make that straight impression, not that it's in there, but.
I know you said it was very initial, but on the cost, did I understand you say right, though, that this option and building the bus barn would actually be
more expensive than building a new location for all? I mean, currently, I know that they're all kind of skewed right now, but wasn't that kind of what I,
I would have to get back to you on that one. I had used a lower square footage than what ended up as the process was evolving.
We did something new, retrofit something good as you want it.
One of the reasons I was asking about parking is because we have a lot of meetings district.
Sure.
Meetings, and actually, we don't have the space now to have the meetings we want to. Correctly, John.
No, that's
Meetings,
true.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, we at least would need 1 or 2 meeting areas, I would think, to get besides the offices. And then we have to have parking spaces.
So then the first thing you have to address before we decide how much stuff to move out here is the tractor flow. You can't add a middle school, you can't add a set bus, you can't add a bus barn without having a plan for how you're gonna change traffic flow, how you're gonna add entries and exits.
And I think that gets tough. I know it was tough. It was built out here because at that time, this was the main highway. And now you're the city, the county, then you're getting the state exit ramps also. Exit ramps. So I don't know if that's a discussion. Right, right.
I mean, you can't have a central office for 3:30 meetings or 3:15 meetings when you have 300 students leaving and one exit. and then
Not the way it is right now. And I think we've looked at it over several years for the flow out here, and
Just kind of give up
I
because
think
there's
it's
no.
gonna involve, I think it's gonna, I mean, it's gonna involve, from the city on, you know, how can we,
Yeah.
how and what can we do?
I still maintain that at least putting a roundabout out there keeps everybody moving.
Well, a lot of times when we get into developing existing or new sites, the city will want to do a traffic study, and it's pretty common to start to have discussion about, do we need to make some improvements to a public road, to that turning lane?
Yeah, you can do that.
Right turn, left turn out, so there may be a lot of those discussions when you increase traffic flow about the city, county road to support that additional traffic flow and turn lanes.
Any thoughts, Barb? I mean, that's kind of in your former realm, right?
With the city or with county roads?
Well, I mean, you've had, you know, city roads,
City.
which also would encompass probably some of the.
Some of the county, some of
also.
the county.
But, I mean, thoughts
And
on our.
is there enough space for, like they're saying, and I'm sorry, I haven't heard a word you've said. You know, is there enough space out here to have all of this they're talking about? Plus, when you have activities and to fill, say, an auditorium, which of course is a high priority of mine, but an auditorium and, or gymnasiums and all this, but enough parking also.
Yeah.
And still have a nice, pleasant landscaped area, not
Yeah,
just
based on
concrete.
68 acres, I think when we get the civil and site planning specialist involved, I think this quantity of space is going to be adequate to support parking, plus the function of the middle school auditorium.
And central.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's,
You know, that
that's
would be-
my anticipation would be based on 68 acres. I think there's physically enough land. Now, is it going to be a straightforward, simple process to figure out how to do that, make it all look right? No, that will be some.
And the exiting and, entrance and exiting, is there any space off to the north and east? know we can't hook into their,
Yeah, I suspect this guy's kind of off limits to off ramp, but I don't have a good sense of if there's any limitations to coming off the south side and what that would involve. And then again,
and what's happening on the north? How close, how much land is on the north?
You're right.
you're pretty much,
I mean, you're not, I meant, what's on, is there land available or, you know, and then even on the east?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to those questions tonight.
Has anybody looked at that?
I believe that's Ravine area, right?
That's what?
Ravine area.
Oh, it's ravine. So the only other way would be from the south.
Yeah, and we were guessing that if there is another curb cut, they want to align with the road on the other side. So whether or not we can get one or two additional access points, whether or not this road would need to be widened with some turn lanes,
You know, but-
roundabouts, but I mean, there's probably some traffic engineering to go
Yeah,
along
but
with
it
this.
still just go on to Grand Avenue or would be able to come west. No, I appreciate being able to, that it said on the radio that the public could come, so thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, if there are questions, let us
Very
know.
good beginning.
So maybe we'll talk about next steps.
Sure.
So I think we would encourage any feedback and let all this, we've thrown a lot of different ideas, but we would encourage maybe any direct feedback you have, maybe pass it to John and you can get some comments to us. If there's some things you're like, thanks for bringing that up, but that's not of interest to us, or let's study this one further, or you guys didn't think about this scenario, what about that? And we'd like to get more questions from you. You guys have had a lot of good comments so far in this process. I know you've got a school board meeting next Monday. We weren't thinking of doing, I think that's more of a procedural meeting for you to set your board. The last sheet in that packet was just sort of here's a one-page summary of what we talked about for about 2 hours tonight. So I don't know if you want to give them just a copy of that or have us call in and give a 10-minute synopsis, or if you want to sort of think about this and not even make that part of your next board agenda. We thought we'd get your feedback on what sort of communication or updates you want to give to the board as far as our general progress in this effort. I don't know if you have any comments about that for tonight.
So I like this. This is good. I mean, this is quick.
Okay. Well, just let me know if, I think some of this group's traveling, not around on Monday, but if you wanted to set up a Zoom call and have me dial in and do a 10-minute walkthrough of that spread, of that sheet, or if you just want to provide the sheet for information, we're happy to do whatever degree you want the update to be for the board on Monday.
Would it be possible to draw something up or see what it would look like whether it be in one building or 2 or 3 of what that first option would look like out here with the bus barn
Yeah.
maintenance?
Probably by Monday would be extremely diagrammatic.
I mean, yeah, I think there could be a couple of different scenarios on that, rather than, whether it's all in one, whether it's here, a bus here, maintenance over here,
Yeah. I think.
Just to kind of give us an idea of what it
I mean,
give
there
me
was-
an
I
idea.
think there were some great questions about if we do a middle school out here, does it want to be right next to or close, or is it connected? So I think I want to be cautious not to show something people think, well, that's the plan, and
Right.
it doesn't make good sense, it's just a couple boxes.
Well,
on
I'm
it.
just thinking like having 2 gyms readily available in 2 buildings or next to each other.
Sure.
I mean, that is huge, because we're constantly fighting over gym space.
So the fields that are directly south of here, is that just primarily for practice or band and?
Soccer, marching band.
What do you think, Damien?
PE, physical education. Very schematic.
Well, and I think as the internal conversations we've been having with central office, that's really what we're thinking. Really, all of our ideas have been based around that being the first building that you see right out here, kind of where you put Wisdom West and homeschool. That's really what we've been talking about with where our
Well, that might be,
central
I mean, we've
office.
seen some districts that have those all together, where they did a new central office and under the same roof, they put the alternative school, just because it made sense to build one building. So we could add,
If we're asking for some kind of
Well,
schematic like
I
that.
don't want to be forceful, and I don't want the
But
public
that's-
to think that, well, this is where they're all, they've already got a blank plan, you know. Well, I just,
But
it's
yes,
kind
but
of
if
for
we
my
want to
own-
see what we're kind of already talking, we don't want to put central office back way behind the building, right? No. That's not necessarily desirable.
I think we want to make sure we are using the space out here as effectively as we can.
Yeah.
I think
And
that's.
if you look at it right now, and you guys have studied it, that's what it is. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I would think there would be something a little more efficient.
I think it would be, I mean, you guys, it's just going through your mind, like, how are we gonna solve this? You're eager to think about the solutions, and I think we can do a schematic. I would caution being careful about doing some survey and getting some community involvement about, you know, is the auditorium a priority? Is a new middle school here a priority versus two new elementaries? So I think it will help you guys process what you're hearing tonight, but I want to make sure, to your point, it doesn't come off as, well, they kind of listen to what we said on a Tuesday night and got a plan on a Monday night, where they think they want to meet you guys.
No, but as an option, putting a bigger picture of this acreage, what could it, like, as an option with everything, because in all of these, you know, I have your ideas for now, but if we maximize the space, what are the options like?
Do you have the original plans for out here?
Yes. He probably has the blueprints.
Would you mind sharing them with us at some point in time?
Was that?
Would you mind sharing them with us at some point in time?
The
So we go
original
back and
drawings,
say,
I know
okay, 97, this is what they were doing.
The site plan, yeah, the site
there's
plan.
a- there's a site plan.
Yeah, there should
I
be.
have to have that.
And it shows the auditorium, they show a couple of classrooms on the end. It shows that they're expecting, the field out by the locker rooms. Do you want me to send that to Sean?
Yeah.
I mean,
We'll jump back to next steps. So,
that's in the back.
It's in the back room at our office. We have the big map layout in the back of the office.
so maybe follow with you, John, more about sort of communication for the board, what sort of you want to see.
What do you guys, so I have a couple of questions for you for Monday. One is what time, where, because we would do, we need to do a special session to consider the abstract of the vote. And then there may be some other policy things depending on what, how the circuit court rulings go, and then we would have the organizational meeting. So as part of the special session, we would, you know, assuming all the board members would be here, you want Midas to dial in for 10 minutes, or do you just want to talk about it?
I think we can
So-
share this out and just have a discussion.
Okay.
I think we can do that.
Yeah.
All right.
So then the next item we had was to discuss options for community engagement. We went through, as an example, we went through a recent successful bond project in Washington. They had been talking about a middle school with one of the things we did in that community was the school really helped. We provided the options, but they put together a survey on their website and advertised it around the community. Hey, there's a Google survey, and you can tell us what you like. Here's option 1, which is renovate, keep the old one. Here's option 2, which is build a brand new middle school. Here's option 3, which is to do something at the high school campus and integrate them. So in your scenario, I could see that putting a lot of these different things we talked about tonight, us helping organize a survey for you to get community feedback on. Do you like the idea of whole grade sharing? Do you like the idea of 2 new elementary schools replacing 4 old elementary schools? Do you like the idea of focusing on a new middle school at the campus, at the high school campus? Kind of try to not make it overly complex, but maybe we boil it down to maybe 3 to 5 really kind of big picture issues that are sort of the driving vision of what's in these documents, and get some online feedback first. So we give opportunity for anybody that wants to either vote on what they think the priorities are. You can dial in and say, I think the auditorium should be the #1 priority. Get some data.
Not necessarily, I just don't want it to be forgotten like it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And then follow that up with some open community meetings. It might be something where you not just mention it on the radio, but hey, we're having either a board meeting tonight, or we're having a community information meeting. The architects and the construction manager are going to give an update on the sort of the budgets and the options for these, and we've had some online feedback. Here's what we're hearing so far, and then try to get both online and physical.
So how much feedback do they, so let's just use Washington, how much feedback did they get?
They took that process very seriously. I mean, they said, here's 3 options. If you want to vote, you guys, if there's 500 people that chime in and they all vote for keeping the old one renovating, we're going to listen to what you say. And so they took the process of getting community feedback very seriously.
I don't have a problem with the voting, but I feel like there's some issues that need to be put out in the community before that's even an option. You know, they need to understand what some of the costs that we're starting to run into are, and just kind of really understand where everything's kind of at before we say, okay, what option do you really want?
Well, for you, I don't think it's a pick one of 3. I mean, they were on one issue. How do we address the middle school? You're talking about what's the next 5 to 10 years, and how do we prioritize elementary needs, central district
Right.
needs, middle school options, but maybe more just how, of these 5 things, what would you put as the top 3 for us to do in the first 5 years? Or, I mean, we can be creative in how we do that, but just getting the big picture ideas of what we're talking about, all looking out on the web, and getting people an opportunity to chime in and give their feedback.
So poor Chad doesn't have to run to 8 different locations, in a day to try to address what's happening.
Well, so I guess we can have some of this conversation Monday. We look at this and then, discuss next steps and options for community. And then, we can talk about Esser project things as well. Just got some numbers and not a, well, think about that. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. We can leave it as a special session, then just be discussion items.
I was going to say that we want to have a discussion after the transition, because obviously Derek's coming on, so.
Well, there's nothing that, oh wait, well, you gotta, you need to approve it. You need to consider and accept the abstract notes, so we really need to do that first before we do the organization.
want to try to have some work done next summer. We may want to accelerate that discussion. I think getting some high-level community feedback and a public forum maybe in the month of December would be a good opportunity. And then ultimately, we'll have a master plan that's a revised, sort of a fine-tuned version of this that we will want to present to the board. Here's the summary of where we're at. There'll be more, usually we integrate the costs into that after there's been more discussion. So some of the stuff that Cindy's started at a high level will be integrated into that. And then really after that, the district can start to think about potential projects, or are they going to do some that are safe funded first, and those will come after the overall master plan. And to whatever degree you need some help from either one of us, we can start to do that once you've got through the community engagement process on the final report.
The ballpark figures that we got in June, buildings, that would be, mining relocations, or that would be included in,
That's without finding new locations.
really just construction.
Do you all want Cindy to send sort of a summary of things you all asked us about cost?
Say it again.
Would you like Cindy to send
Yes.
you a copy of the first pass at the high level budgeting on this? Well, again, we appreciate opportunity to.
Do we have the glazed overlook?
No, I mean, I think this is the one we wanted to have some fun and sort of finally give you what you hopefully you're looking
Yeah.
for, is some suggestions and ideas. And again, just keep an open mind